Boardroom Bound, episode 71, providing instant impact in your board role with Ivy Slater.
So very often young people say, well, I haven't done enough yet. I don't know enough yet. So if we look at not now, when, what is qualified to know enough? If we start looking and developing a board career, what is it going to look like?
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Ivy Slater. And she is a consultant and a career expert and has her own series, Her Success Story. And I loved a mini-series she did about women in the boardroom. And she also has a book on this topic that she published called From the Bar to the Boardroom, Choreographing Business Success Through Authentic Relationships. And what we're going to do is hear from Ivy, from what she has learned, from all the people she's interviewed, from all these experiences, the best practice guidance and advice. And we're going to bring it into your room today. And some of it's going to be familiar. We had a few of her guests on our show as well, and they were fabulous. It'll be great to share those with you today. Let's jump into the show. Ivy Slater, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Alexander, it's such a pleasure to be here with you today.
Well, this is great fun for me because we're fellow podcasters, and yours, Her Success Story, is a great one where I learned from you about doing series and mini-series on different topics. And in fact, I think that's how we connected, because you had one about women on boards, and since that I've seen you've done so many others, which are lots of fun. So it's going to be great to be able to talk today about how we bring the right information to people, because you've been doing the same thing. We've had similar guests on our show. And before we dive into all of those great details, though, I'd love to give some context, because you didn't just start Her Success Story. You began somewhere far before that and build up this reputation, this brand, including the best-selling book that you have. Perhaps you can just give some context for our audience.
Sure. Things didn't just happen. I've been a business owner for over 25 years. I started early on in my late 20s in the printing industry and started truly building a brand, worked with an enormous amount of publishing companies, companies that publish magazines, including the Hearst Communications and the Condé Nast of the world. As you know, I was in that industry for over 20 years, built a great career, realized that I didn't want to die a printer, that I had dreams as a younger woman. Yeah, I know. And it truly, at 45, is like, oh my goodness, I had all these dreams. I was going to be a dancer when I was younger. I was going to be a producer. I was going to do this, that, and the other thing. I was like, well, I'm making a great living, but damn, I can't die this way. There has to be more. On a lark, truly, I was working out, and a friend of mine said, you ought to become a coach. And I was looking out over these fields where my kids used to play soccer, and my son played football, and I was like, what? A coach for children? And this, to date this was 2007, and the coaching industry was not what it is today. Mm-hmm. So I didn't quite understand what they were talking about. At that point, one of my gut instincts is always do your research. Market research is an enormous amount of value, and never let that just pass you by. So I went home and I was like, okay, how do I research this? I hit Google, and I learned that, coaching, first thing that came up was tennis. So it's like, okay, that's what I thought. What else is there? Delved into it, then started speaking to every person I knew who might know something. So I spoke to some friends who were psychotherapists. I spoke to a friend of mine who did a lot of work in the media and television industry. And I said, you guys are on the pulse. Have you heard about this industry called coaching? She goes, yeah, we're starting to get a lot more coaches on air. I was like, okay, so it's an industry. Is it an industry people make a living at or not? Is it a hobby industry? I truly asked. I spoke to my attorney. I spoke to my accountant. And I started to connect with, the original executive coaches of the world. and I interview them. Like we're doing today, you're interviewing me, and I interview people for her success story. And when I understood that it was actually an industry, a profession, and it was a very early stage in '07, I started creating the plan that navigated my future forward.
And so the business, I'm sure, like most, has morphed and grown and changed over time, and now you have different platforms, right? So let's talk about the book, for example, then we'll talk about the podcast. I'm sure the book probably did amazing things for raising your visibility and the opportunities that have come from that.
Yes, the book is called From the Bar to the Boardroom, Choreographing Business Success Through Authentic Relationships. And it is a little bit of my business story, a little bit of my life story, and a hell of a lot of business lessons, as well as an enormous amount of worksheets to get people actually working and designing themselves as leaders. And I wrote the book because I was like, I was at my next level of transformation. This business has evolved from opening in January of '08 to being in 2020. We've had many, many evolutions, all for the good, and many, many lessons. And it's understanding and being in the pulse of business to not just say what's next, but to have that level of evaluation. What is working today? What is changing in business? What is coming new tomorrow? What has changed in the communities? What has changed in the various types of businesses? Some businesses are on a decline, some business models are on an incline. What does that look like? And the one thing, Alexandra, that has transcends all of it for me, and that's what drove me to write the book, is the value of authentic relationships. And having amazing relationships in my life, I'm not saying personal, I'm not saying business, I'm saying in my life, has made an enormous impact on my professional career.
Well, I think the statistics also show it's not only on the career, but on your personal life and the quality and the happiness. And of course, we think that probably reflects back to everything you're doing as well. So that is probably just one piece of your story, right? And you've clearly shared a lot about yourself personally there. And for our audience, we're not talking about a bar where you'd go for an adult beverage or even the legal bar. So bar is the dance perspective, right? Just so we can paint the scene for our audience.
Correct. Bar is BARRE, and it's from my background as a dancer. And it's understanding, as many of our careers transcend, what value you take from one to another. And I realized as a business owner, the impact of my early years as a dancer and the impact it's made. For instance, the idea of discipline. A dancer will warm up before every class, before every performance. There's a regimen. We'll be standing there, as a younger woman and cleaning a table, and my feet are possibly like doing tendus, doing the dishes, and I'm doing something. You're doing this all the time. And that discipline and that dedication to the art form, to your health and wellness, to being at your best, we could think about that. How do we do that in business today? Are we showing up in that same level of dedication? People have asked me many times, like, Ivy, where do you get the energy sometimes, when an obstacle comes in a way or a curveball comes at you? I'm like, well, I fell down early on in my dance career. You would take a leap and you would end up on your butt. Why wouldn't you do that? And you get right back up and you keep going. That's the same thing in business, in our world today. So there was an enormous amount of lessons to share.
And some of the stuff that resonated with me of my wife has also been a dancer, and then as she was phasing out of that, taught the bar method. So there were a lot of circle of life stuff coming together there for me. But when I think about your podcast series on her success story, you had one about women on boards, and clearly the book is tied in with that in some ways. And you've had some amazing speakers. And I know that because some of them were on our show. Like Deb Pine is fabulous, and the statistics she shares on our episode were phenomenal. Sheila Ronning as well, great personal stories that resonate, some pithy ways of giving grabbing some good sayings and putting it out there. And I'm sure when you had that series, it was so much fun to put it together and learning best practice and ideas and guidance from all these different people. I love the way you summarized it. And I think I might take from you, you've got an intro and an outro to a mini series that you lead. So I like that. I might take that as well. I would love if you could, let's just sort of begin at a higher level. Like, what was it that led you to do this series, and what did you begin to learn from it as you're having these conversations?
So I was sitting in an audience. I was at a benefit, and I have a strong heart around nonprofits, and I believe we could all find something to give to. And we're not talking monetarily always. We could show up in any way. So I was sitting in the audience, and I listened to this woman speak and she was in the finance world, and she started talking about women on boards. And I just leaned forward. My hands started writing notes that I couldn't keep up with. And I realized there was 200 people in the room, and you could only imagine at the conclusion of the event, the scrambling to meet everybody. And I was like, I just went straight for her. And I went over and I introduced myself, and I said, I'd really like to have a conversation with you further. What you talked about was a huge impact. I understand, from what I understand, you're New York based. She said, sure, my offices are right here on this street. And I was like, wow, 5 blocks from my office. Are you open to having coffee? I'll follow up. Can I have your email? I will. And I just did not even think, and this is, just so the audience gets this, because I think it's important, I am innately an introvert. I set my knife not speaking to strangers early on. You put me in a room of 200 people, and if I don't know a couple of people, I want to be under that table. But I heard her speak, and I was so moved. I said, this is so important. There's 200 people in the room, 200,000 people have to hear this. And I let go of my discomfort, and I focused on the importance, and I went up and I had a conversation with her. I followed up. I connected her to her on LinkedIn. I sent an email, and I said, I explained I have a podcast, and I'd really like to learn more. I'd like to be able to help other people learn. And she was very intrigued. And it took a few months. I'm not going to say it didn't. And we sat down and had a cup of coffee in New York City. And I said, this is, I want to hear more. I got some of the statistics. I was searching your name. Where else can I find articles? And I came in with this agenda to find out this information. And this goes back to relationships. And we ended up sitting over coffee and talking about our moms who were aging and what it was like to be adult children with aging parents. And in that connection, in that personal connection, we became women. And then I shared my mission, and she was like, I'm in. And Alexandra, the ironic piece here is her interviews never got heard.
Oh,
because
she didn't?
The company she works.
Oh.
No, it's the most amazing interview with the most amazing statistics and information. And she has connected me to numerous people that we've been interviewed with. And it's so important the connection happened because we were able to get personal, because we were able to get real. We've become friends. She is going to be interviewed again in 2020. And she's an amazing, dynamic, brilliant woman who was the catalyst for doing this and the result for getting great interviews and insight out there.
So, Ivy, one of the things that really jumps out at me listening to you is something that's a good advice for everybody, whether you're introverted or extroverted, however you want to think about it, of you were starting your networking. And you found someone, clearly it was a good fit. Personally, it turned out to be, but you were willing to put yourself out there, go have a conversation. At the end of the day, all the board seats are filled because of networks. So someone knows you and they trust you and they value you. Of course, you have to be on par and have the right skill sets and value added. But that was the beginning of this process for you. If you were thinking about going from the bar to the boardroom, if we borrow from your book, you would have to have those right conversations, and you were doing that. And it's something that we are constantly reminding our audience of. Put yourself out there. Whatever whatever the frequency is, whatever the opportunities are, you have to seize that. And that's what you began to do. And I imagine as you sort of built the series for Women on Boards on your show, you were just getting to do more of that. It was probably great fun. And I wonder if there were more thoughts from yourself about this was what I learned was the right way for, somewhat of my personality and my approach to be doing that. You interviewed some great people and some great information came out of it. What are your thoughts about that?
One of the biggest things I learned is always to not hold back on the ask. Because with my show, at the end of when we wrap the recording up, whoever I'm interviewing, I ask the question of, now that you had the experience of joining me on her success story, is there anybody else that you might like to connect me to who you think would be a great guest? And then I'll share a couple of series we have coming up in the year. And this is how I will fill my series like 6 months forward. And when we did the series on the impact of women on boards, when I started asking this question, I had people flood to me. We had more opportunity to interview people than I thought I was going to have to scramble to fill it. But because I truly was open about the ask, and I asked people, who do you know? Who do you think would be a great story, a great impact? And they loved it because it shows that I trust them, that I value their insight, and people really respond beautifully to that. And I was one of the interviews that, if people want to go back and listen, was the very last interview we did on Women on Boards, the impact of women on boards, where we had 2 board members from Deloitte, partners, and a man and a woman sharing their combined story of how they see the impact of women on boards from a male and a female perspective. And I was like, tickled pink. I couldn't have gotten to those people. I didn't think I could get to those people in my wildest dreams. Yet I'm probably going to be having coffee with one of them this year, because we've stayed in touch, because we built that personal connection as well.
And that at the end of the day is the key, right? So you were adding value for your audience, but at the same point, building a brand and a reputation that, for example, would be invaluable for you as you go forward, because we talk about the kind of people that are, if we call them the influencer type, think about the consultants, the actuaries, the lawyers, the sorts of people that are in the boardroom regularly, engaging with people in the boardroom, know about the various opportunities. And when they come to know an individual and their capabilities and what a fit would be, it's just natural that that's in their mind if you've built a relationship with them. So I don't want to call it self-serving. I don't want to think of it as pay it forward. It's just part of networking and the way that works. And it sounds like you were doing that, and it was a very successful thing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it's a matter of giving. It's a matter of a win-win. Everybody wins. Well, when you truly build when you build the network around and great relationships, and you give and you receive.
Absolutely. And when I think about your shows and what you fleshed out, I loved that male-female one. And that's something that I think I might have to borrow at some point. I'll take the great methodology that you came up with there. I have always been intrigued by getting diversity of thought, is the way I'll describe it, into the boardroom. So it's very easy to see, whether the photo of the board has very many females in it versus the males. And that's why I'm a huge fan of and enjoy being part of 2020 Women on Board and being part of the steering committee and pushing that forward. Certainly socioeconomic basis. We would love people who have been international experience, lots of different perspectives. That's how you get there. And we're seeing good things happen. There's a lot of great organizations out there. 30% Club is another that are really help pushing the bar together. And it's amazing how we get into different pockets of the world, like with your podcast, that you were speaking to a need for your audience, and you were getting great feedback by just an example of all the different guests that were coming forward for you. And
I have to tell you, I was floored of the people who were saying, "Oh my goodness, let me connect you to this one. Let me connect." And I said, "Okay, great." I just said, "Great, thanks." And they would circle back to me and say, "Oh, how'd it go? And I'm so excited to listen to the interview." I'm like, people are fabulous, and people want to give and they want to help. Most of the time, they don't know how. So when you ask that specific question, it gives them an opportunity to give and know they can make an impact. And it's so important for all of us.
I'd love to pick on that specificity point there, because it's a wonderful thing. If you're one of our listeners on this show and you're thinking, I either want to land another board role or my first board role and preparing for that, when you go to someone for the networking and you're asking for help, I liken it to someone who knocks on your door and says, let's say they're a recent college graduate and they're saying, I'm trying to get a job. Can you help? And you're thinking, not with that. That's too broad. I have no idea what you want to do, what your capabilities are, what doors I could open for you. It's the same way of someone who comes and says, I want a board role. What kind? Nonprofit, for-profit, public, private, large, small, what industry, what's your expertise? And you're really trying to help the people help you. So your specific question of, this is the series I'm running, I'm looking for these sorts of people to be on the show as guests. It's easy for someone to say yes or no, I do or don't have that. And then, am I excited? Will I go open some doors? Will I go ask some people for names for you? So I think you're absolutely right. And I think that comes back to all of us thinking about how do we bring our best selves into the boardroom is by being more clear about what we want to do. And I'm sure you probably got some of that guidance from some of your different guests, right?
Absolutely. Many of my different guests, if you ask them specifically at the end, I'm looking to the very, very first series I did. This is taking me back a while. The very first series I did was Women in the C-Suite. And I was like, okay, but I don't want just like smaller business. I want some impactful businesses. I was like, how am I going to find them? And I just started asking. At the end, I would interview somebody and say, by the way, we're going to be launching our first mini-series in a few months, and I'm looking to interview women in the C-suite. Women in the C-suite. Any thoughts come to mind on great people to interview that you might be able to connect me with from your network? And they're so happy because they can do something. It's specific. It's a specific action. And people feel great when we help others. It is so fulfilling. And part of being on board is that fulfilling piece, because we're helping make that difference in organizations, whether it be profit or nonprofit.
And that makes a lot of sense. I wonder if, our audience, I'm sure, will be listening to your series on this, which we'll have links to because it's a great way to get some more information, hear some good voices of thought. Ivy, I'm wondering if there's any things that you heard that you thought, oh my gosh, I had never thought of this, or this is such clearly a best practice that I wish everybody knew. Were there any of those sort of aha moments throughout the series for you?
I think the biggest aha moment was this general consensus. When I thought about it, I thought about, well, why are they talking about 3? Why is this impact 3? What does this mean? Well, 3 is the number. I'm like, what's with this 3 number? And when I forgot which interview it was, but they literally took us through the board and they used examples of, if you think of a board and they're like, Ivy, just think of a dozen people. Let's keep it simple. I was like, okay, so say a third, a third, a third. If you have a third from this diverse group and a third from this diverse group and a third from this diverse group, and it got me thinking, and I'll be honest, I don't know if this was actually ever in the recordings or if this was a pre-interview, because we do a lot of pre-interview meetings before we go live, and they just truly gave me a great piece of background. They're like, well, if you have some people on the board from this socioeconomic are going to see the world from a certain perspective, and you have people, men, women, various ethnicities, they're going to come from their background. We know so much from our lives that we don't realize we know. We didn't just learn everything, whether it be in our college degree, our MBA program, our law program. It doesn't matter. We still have so much life experience that we based our decisions on. And when you bring people from different backgrounds, from different life experiences, into a consensus of making a decision going forward, we get to see the whole rainbow, the whole spectrum. And it gives us enlightenment and education that we can think forward to not just where we are, but the impact we're making. Very often, what we're trying to do is see into the future. We're making decisions on the next year the next 5 years, the next 10 years of an organization. So when we're visioning forward and creating those strategic plans, we have that full spectrum, that rainbow of experience that we could launch from. That resonated with me, and it was the light bulb that went off in my head. I was like, this isn't about the women on boards. This is about a diverse board. Because when a board is diverse, we could really plan forward because we have so much more information.
And in some ways, it can be very simple in ways we don't think about it. I think it's very easy for all of us to wrap our heads around today that a room full of all men isn't diverse. But the first major board that I was on for a very large pension, helping lead the investment committee, it was pale, male, and stale. There was one woman on it, but I was youngest by a wide margin. Everyone was over a certain age that I shall not say. And I was also the only American on it. Everyone else was from the UK. So brought two very different perspectives. And I remember often sitting in the meetings going, why have we never thought of this? And I'd look around and I'm like, well, that's why we've never thought of this, because it's a different way. Diversity of thought only can lead to innovation much more easily than if you don't have diversity. It's not that you can't innovate if you don't have diversity, but I think it just lends itself to different discussions and topics. So one of our previous guests, Cheryl Batchelder, who's been a 2-time CEO of large public companies, been board member for about 4 different major companies that we would all recognize. She talked about being the first woman on a board and how it changes the discussion, changes the dynamic, and the group just begins to think differently. So kudos to you for having those discussions. I love the episode about the male and female sharing their different perspectives on it. But I know listening to some of the episodes that some of those sort of light bulb moments that just reinforce the concepts that we talk a lot about on our show is one of them popped out was like the importance of starting early. And I know you covered that in several of the episodes. What did you take away from that?
That if not now, when? So that's my big quote from it, if not now, when? And here's what I mean. I started early in business. I started early being a business owner. I became a partner in in the first printing company. I became a small partner before I turned 31. So what is it about starting early? So I might not have been ready to lead lead $1 million organization at the time, but I was ready to start getting into leadership. So the same thing works with boards. We don't want all board members in their 60s. You know what? Because guess what? Being a woman in her 50s, I can't speak on technology in the same way. I didn't grow up with technology. Yet technology is part of business, whether it's a technology platform or if it's just basic business. Somebody has to know about technology. Well, the younger we look and the younger we get started, they bring a breadth of knowledge. So very often young people say, well, I haven't done enough yet. I don't know enough yet. So if we look at not now, when, what is qualified to know enough? If we start looking and developing a board career, if we want to add that into our lifespan, what is it going to look like? I have, some of my daughter's friends, and they're not even 30 yet, are on boards in nonprofits. Why? Because they so care about organizations. I have spoken for young executive committees on boards because why not? They have a breadth of knowledge that us older people, and I'll call myself out, don't think that way. We need their insight. So if not now, when? I have a young client who was just invited to be on her first board, and she's tickled pink. She is so excited. She's like, I'm scared out of my mind. She goes, but I get to make an impact. And if not now, when? So we need our young people to get involved. You might not be chairman of the board yet, but the second you step into that ring, in any sense of leadership, you're taking that step towards it.
And I think that's a great perspective. I think maybe we'll perhaps call that the episode title for this show, or at least the subtitle, if not now, when, because the goal for all of us is if we're thinking about that, you need to be taking steps today. You need to be preparing yourself. You might have thought I should have started yesterday, but you are where you are today. Begin forward, make those steps, continue to progress. And Ivy, I'm just so pleased about your Impact of Women on Board series, and I'm delighted to share with our audience because some great information, some great insights. And the goal for all of us is to give ourselves the right information, the right ideas to build that network, to build that platform authority, to go and make a difference, just like you talked about, because the driver isn't earning the compensation. Maybe that's a secondary, tertiary, quaternary part of it, but that's never the ideal situation of why someone wants to go forward. You want to go probably gain some more skill sets to enjoy what you're doing, but really to be able to make a difference in a way you haven't in your prior role. So I'm thrilled to be able to share what you have done with our audience, and I'm delighted to have had you on this show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Alexandra, thank you for having me. And, if everybody takes away one thing, anything from today, identify one step that you could take towards your goal around being involved in boards, on a board, learning more about it. Wherever you are in your journey, identify one step you can take and take that step.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Ivy Slater. It's great to hear from someone who is doing in some ways similar stuff to we are, from the series she did about the boardroom on her podcast, from what she wrote in her book, and sharing all of that knowledge with our audience today. Delighted to bring that to you. And if you want to go over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will get links to all of the resources we discussed today. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.